Hi, everybody. First of all, welcome again. Thanks for the awesome introduction, Ben. Today, my name's Cameron, and today we're going to be talking to you guys a little bit about accountability in the just transition, a project we worked on this summer with Cornell Climate Jobs Institute, myself, Hannah, Priya, and Olivia. So a quick overview, we're going to cover context and framework, key questions, methodology, data collection, results, analyses, and our findings. Now, before we get into this, the Cornell Climate Jobs Institute does a lot of congressional research looking to influence policy within the renewable energy industry. So our client, them, and our lead there, Avalon, have been tasked with creating a worker-facing survey to be able to identify companies or developers that are maybe not using the best labor practices in the renewable industry. So looking for low wages, insignificant pay, unsafe working conditions, and then union busting and anti-organizing efforts. And this is really essential because we don't have a lot of research that is coming from a worker perspective, which is, again, critical for a just transition.
So really quickly, before we go into this, I'm going to go through some key terms that we're going to use throughout the presentation. And the first is OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration. This is kind of what we're using as a standard for workplace safety practices. So the term we use is OSHA flags, and this is notices of all OSHA-related activities. It includes inspections, incidents, and investigations of complaints. And not all OSHA flags will lead to OSHA violations, which are reported instances of when a company or employee ignores the safety hazards. You'll notice that we focus more on OSHA flags. And the reason for that is because we noticed through our research that a lot of OSHA violations and their associate penalties were oftentimes waived or settled outside. So kind of according to client wishes, we focus more on OSHA flags as more representative of what we're looking for. We also have WARN notices, worker adjustment and retraining notification. Essentially, the WARN Act of 1988 requires that companies with more than 100 employees have to submit a notice 2 months ahead of mass layoffs. And that applies to layoffs of over 50 employees who have been employed for over 6 months and work more than 20 hours a week.
So to be able to further influence our research and help the Climate Jobs Institute, we had a couple of key questions that we wanted to answer. First, are there any kind of significant trends between OSHA and WARN in any of the findings that we come up with? Is there any sort of relationship geographically or that we could see across state lines or further areas? And then how could this be helpful for both organizers and policymakers? So diving into the methodology, we initially needed to collect data. So CJI provided us with a list of variable Texas projects and New York projects for solar and wind. And we were able to grab all that information, clean it, and then supplement that with stakeholder research to try and create more of a narrative. And then ultimately put that information into Data Wrapper and create visuals that would be interactive for both the policymakers and organizers. And this is kind of what that would look like. So the top image on the left is how we would search for OSHA hits. And once we found a flag, that could spider out and end up creating multiple citations within one individual interaction between OSHA and a particular company, and you can see that in orange.
So we worked on two separate states, New York and Texas, so we've kind of separated our results based on that. I won't go too deep into each deliverable because that's what the results is for. But something I did want to point out is that for state of New York, we focused almost exclusively on solar, and then for Texas, we were really focusing on both solar and wind, or just key renewable projects. So without further ado, I'm gonna go into New York. So we looked at solar installations in the state of New York, categorized by county, and interpret that data in 3 different ways. So the first map shows the number of solar installations, and you can kind of see that it's predominantly like in the urban areas of New York City, Long Island, surrounding counties leading up to Albany. That's where the majority of them are. And that makes sense because that's where most people live. And the second map, that's by solar kilowatt installed, or by capacity, the cumulative capacity of the projects for each county. So you see a lot of similar patterns again, probably related to population density. I will say that like Western upstate New York had a bit more here, indicating potentially larger projects are happening there since they don't have as many projects. And then the third one is median solar kilowatt installed. This is really interesting, especially when you put it together with the other maps, because what it shows is that the average capacity of projects in the more urban areas is actually pretty small. You can see it's like a lighter green. And the larger average median size of the projects goes up when you go up the counties as well. There is one outlier you can see in dark green, Allegheny County. It's because it has very few solar projects, and the one that it has is huge, so it totally skews our map. Don't worry about it. But what this tells us is that there are a lot more solar installation projects and cumulative kilowatts are being generated in the denser, more urban areas, but they're smaller and most likely residential as well. Whereas more of the projects in other parts of New York State are probably commercial, larger ones. And then we looked at top developers. So organized by the top map, which is like the number of projects that they're involved in, and top developers in each county looking at their kind of cumulative solar kilowatt of solar energy that they're generating. So how we made this map was essentially we looked at the top developer for each of these categories and assigned them a county. So one county is only associated to one developer. And what you immediately notice is that geographic clusters appear when you sort it by the greatest number of projects in the first one. But those clusters disappear when you go by capacity on the bottom map. And what it really shows is that like certain regions, mostly the urban ones, again, spreading from like that New York City, Long Island area up to like Albany, they have dominant developers that are doing the most projects in kind of these clusters of counties, but they skew towards smaller capacity sites. And we know that again, because looking at the second map, it's like the pattern doesn't hold. And what this really does is it highlights the need for different canvassing strategies. If you want to be strategic and look at more localized impact, maybe you go for a certain developer that does more projects there. But you also have to keep in mind that these projects are probably smaller with a more dispersed workforce that are moving between project to project. This also goes for OSHA. This has become significant when you look at that because there aren't many, and they're all in the New York City area, but that probably has to do with the fact that there are way more projects going on in this area, and they're smaller as well. So for our next visualization, we move away from maps to our charts. The clear outlier here is Sunrun. I don't know what Sunrun is doing, but they're doing a crazy number of projects in New York State. But otherwise, you can see that the interesting thing is larger projects with presumably more workers are not necessarily indicative of more OSHA flags or mass layoffs. The reason why I say they have presumably more workers, and the reason why we focus so much on project capacity, is because project capacity is actually a pretty good proxy for telling how many workers are working on a site. So you can see, sorry, I can't point all the way there. We divided that by each company, and then for each company, we looked at the project site, number of projects, war notices, and OSHA flags as well. And you see that more of the OSHA flags are actually happening with companies that are working on like smaller capacity projects overall. Before we draw any conclusions, though, we do want to note that this is a small sample size and that there's a very complex relationship between companies and subcontractors that is difficult to map. Generally, what I mean by that is you could be working on all these projects, but you could be subcontracting that work out to smaller companies or to other companies, and that's not necessarily recorded, mapped, or regulated. Which brings us to Texas. So this is a map of the key renewable projects in Texas. And this was provided to us by the Climate Jobs Institute and their partnership with the Texas Climate Jobs Project. So, general patterns, there's not too much to say here, but you can see like maybe there's a lot of solar project clusters that are like outside of the major cities, kind of on the west side. There's one really big hydrogen project. What's not on the map, but is really important and becomes relevant for us, is that alongside the list, we were given a list of the known associated companies, parent companies, contractors, and developers. And we supplemented that with further stakeholder research to try to paint as complete a picture as possible. So based on that list of developers that we received, we looked at OSHA flags by these companies within the last 5 years that took place in the state of Texas, and we made this map. So an important thing to note is these are not OSHA flags for those key renewable projects. These are OSHA flags for companies involved in those projects that took place in Texas. And there's actually not too much of an overlap. I think 2 of these OSHA flags are also like in the same site as the key renewable projects. But overall, yeah, not too much of an overlap there. So since there wasn't really a clear pattern in the Texas-only violations, we brought in our search parameters to nationwide OSHA flags to see if there's any geographical patterns there. I think the very first thing you notice is that there's like a lot more. There's a lot more developers who have gotten OSHA flags if you just kind of like move away from Texas a little bit. It's very interesting to note who the repeat offenders are and what would be repeat offenders, but not too much of a geographical pattern, but you can kind of just see more of like the scale and the scope. We did the same thing that we did with New York State in the sense that we put it into kind of these charts. I will say that we're missing kind of the number of projects in Texas because the state of Texas does not require that companies report that information out. So we don't have that essentially. So when you look at this again, I think you see a lot of similar patterns, which is that smaller projects appear to have more OSHA flags, more warn notices, overall like a more problematic history. But again, recognizing similar barriers that we encountered, which this is a really small sample size still, if you look at like how much there was out there on the OSHA establishment base, and a lack of contractor data could mean missing data. And again, what I mean by missing data is that many of these projects will subcontract their work to other companies, but these are not transparent and they're difficult to find a lot of the time. They're not required to be reported, and that makes it difficult to draw any conclusions. So these are kind of generalized findings that we hope with greater application of data and research could lead to deeper insights. And going off of that, here's a list of our overall findings and kind of potential actions or recommendations we're making for them. So I think the very first one is that New York State developers working on smaller scale solar projects can be geographically clustered. And that was an interesting finding that CJI was also like surprised by. And a recommendation we have around that is make sure that we create a canvassing strategy if we're like reaching out to workers in that area or to companies that considers the challenges of organizing that more dispersed workforce where they're working on smaller projects. Also, looking at all those like key Texas project developers, 42% of those companies have been flagged on OSHA and issued warn notices. That's a lot. And for that, like, you know, really what that tells us that we need to continue to advocate for more workers' rights policies. And for this one, honestly, continue monitoring all those companies affiliated with key Texas projects that the Texas Climate Projects is doing. The third one that was a constant refrain was that relationships between parent companies and developers and their contractors, it really lacks a lot of transparency and that limits our insights. And what we recommend is promoting regulation for mandatory reporting of all subcontractors for easier tracking and making sure that we don't run into this issue of potentially missing data. And state-by-state data access disparities exist due to kind of no standardized reporting regulation. One example was the fact that, right, New York State requires their companies to say how many projects they're working on. Texas does not. It makes it difficult to standardize them, and also then from there it makes it difficult for us to make any kind of comparisons between states. So for that, we recommend standardizing how OSHA and warrant violations are reported between states. Thank you. That concludes our presentation. If you have any questions, please let us know.
Yeah, thank you both and the entire team. That was a really, really interesting presentation. I have a friend who was like involved in the gig like element of this work in DC, and like this kind of resonates with some of the challenges that he saw in building it up. And relatedly, I just wondered if you came across anything related to like the relationship between like community involvement in the solar projects, like, and if there was any, I don't know how that works on if there's variation between like how Texas and New York would navigate that, but it seems like some solar projects like scale up through like engaging with the community, and the community helps like actually set them up. And I don't know if that's something that you encountered or not. I wondered, one, if that's something you encountered, and two, like what issues you might, or there might be around that, if so. Because I just saw a headline related to one of the major companies in DC that leveraged community work. They are now like in violation of the parameters around the project. And so now it literally might cost more money in paperwork and time to get these projects up to code than energy saved. So it's just top of mind. Whatever reactions y'all have to that. Thanks.
Oh, thank you for sharing. Also, if like anyone of my team members want to like say anything, because I know some folks are in the audience. But I can say, yeah, thank you for sharing. I think one thing that definitely, at least in my experience as I was doing stakeholder research, but also looking at OSHA, is that it's actually, it's really hard to verify any of the information. So for example, I would go on their websites for different projects. They'd be like, this is going to create 5,000 jobs for local community members. I'd be like, that's great. Where are the numbers? Like, where is the evidence of that? OSHA does not report any of that, but also like because of the whole subcontracting issue again, I have a very difficult time knowing like how many workers are actually working in a company. And I think that's why it's really smart that CJI looks at plant capacity, because if you look at the capacity of the project, you can actually tell how many workers are going to have to work on that project in order for it to be completed. I will say this is not related to the capstone, but my previous job experience, I found that even though our model was around like training folks from the local community into like local jobs, et cetera, I think a lot of these prevalent issues are still there. Our Maryland solar employers actually often had clauses against unionization. So I think regardless of where that's, it's like across the board, but I think it's definitely something that should be looked more into.
Thanks very much for the fascinating presentation. And this is more a comment building on your last remark, which is, I think when we look around the U.S. these days, we see enormous disparities in racial justice, reproductive rights, gender justice, and all the ways that some states really try to avoid any kind of scrutiny and keep things unregulated and invisible. And we're seeing that very directly in kind of worker and class justice as well. And it's really a common theme.
That was a fascinating project. A really quick question. On the overall country map where you're looking at OSHA violations, I know there is no clear pattern per se, but it still seems to be more towards the east part of the country. Is that because of the number of projects, or are there any other factors that come into it?
I have thoughts around that, but does anyone want to respond?
I can respond.
Sure.
Do I need a mic or
You need a mic.
So the question is about why it's more on the east. I wouldn't draw too much out of that. I think it may just be where those companies are headquartered or where they tend to do their work. I know, for example, Duke was one of the companies that we looked at, and they had a ton of entries around North Carolina, South Carolina, and like those Indiana entries are probably also very Duke heavy. So I think it just happens to be where the companies that are interested in Texas were working before. So, but it is interesting to look at it that way.
We also got really good feedback when we did this presentation for our clients, because we already did that. And she was like, maybe some of these more, like maybe the unionized sites actually feel more comfortable bringing up like basically filing a complaint, an OSHA complaint. There's more regulation maybe in some of these states to do so. And there's more ways for it to actually go through the process. And that's something that, should be disaggregated. I don't think we will be doing it, but thank you.